Okay, so moving on, we are now going to look at arguably one of the most interesting parts of the design process itself, and that is called extreme users. And we want to turn something on its head, fundamentally, because in almost every innovation project that I've been part of over the years, people have looked to the majority to provide them with data and ideas about how the innovation project would work. In this methodology, we are going to turn it on its head by focusing on what's known as the extreme users, as the excellent source of inspiration. And you can see here on the chart, the extreme users are at either end of the continuum. Now, you could put it simply and say, well, at one end of the continuum, you will have an individual who may be ambivalent, not interested, really isn't committed at all. Or they could be somebody who is hugely committed to an idea, and yet work is precluding them from contributing. At the other end of the continuum, we have the extreme user who is hugely committed, hugely bought into the idea, and is committed to the degree that it is reflective in their behavior. Now, at both ends of these continuums, certain behaviors become not only identifiable, but become really very, very clear because the proportion of people are much smaller than you would have in the center cluster, which is where traditionally many research projects and innovative projects about organizational development focus their attention. So we're going to turn it on its head. Now, I just want to give some very quick anecdotal examples of where extreme users actually became the focus of attention and to a large extent prompted very significant social change. But before I do, let's go to the group and we'll just get some ideas about this initial way of approaching innovation. So rather than focusing here on the central area where the proportion of individuals would sit, we're looking at the two ends, the extreme users, as we will talk to them. So Tessa, I'd be interested in your immediate response to this approach.
Well, my immediate response is that I really like the idea of focusing on the extreme users because ultimately, I think particularly those who are really early adopters of the change, who are can-do people, who are entrepreneurial and innovative and bring the enthusiasm and the energy to an opportunity, they can significantly influence not just the middle sector, but also those who are holding on to the past. So that bit I really like. The other part of the extreme users at the less adoptive end would be those people who perhaps are grieving that something that is of value to them may be lost.
Okay.
And I think it's really.
Can you give us an example of that?
Well, it may be, for example, that suddenly they find out from the plan that actually what's involved in their day-to-day work that they believe was really significant is now suddenly not present in the new structure and the new strategy. And yet there could be a really important reason why they're holding on to that particular site. And they could provide really important insights, I think, for the other groups.
So, I mean, there are many dimensions to what you say there. And one of them that I take is the meaning that people make about their contribution in any given project at any particular point in time.
And in light of their context.
And in light of the context. And I think it's when we begin to bring context into the range of extreme users that we see some fascinating things that have happened over the years. So, I mean, if we consider what happened back in the very early, late 90s, early 2000s, at the advent of treatment for HIV, the GSK and Pfizer had a very significant part of the jigsaw, each of them. And this collaboration, which was between the UK and the US, brought those two organizations together, and they seeded a third organization. It's not the first time it's happened, but that third organization, they pooled the information into the intellectual property, the research, the science, and came up with groundbreaking treatment for those people who had contracted the HIV virus. So when we're looking at innovation, you never quite know when something is going to turn up. A second example that I want to give about extreme users, which I have always been inspired by, is the work of Reverend Bliss Brown, who in 1992 developed a movement. And the movement itself was about the regeneration and the reimagination of one of the great American cities, Chicago. Now, the reason I want to bring this in is because the original idea, and I was around at the time at the inception of this particular project, was that the people that we used to conduct the analysis were those people who served the city, people who contributed from the local government, from the police, from the fire service, ambulance, paramedics, school teachers, people that worked in utilities, people that supported the management and the evolution of the city and its communities. I think the most inspiring part about that project, and Bliss Brown talks about this brilliantly, was, and the word that she used, which I thought was really interesting, was stumbling across the extreme user that was factored out of all of the research, which were the children of Chicago. And they became a central influencing factor over how the reimagination of Chicago happened, simply because these children were actually going to be the beneficiaries of the Chicago at the end of the project. Those people who had huge contributions to make would arguably be in a very different demographic and will be in a retirement period of their life. So extreme users, what I'm saying with this, come in all shapes and sizes and not necessarily related to age. And also time is an important factor, as Bliss Brown showed out. So what we have then with extreme users is the opportunity to observe these behaviors in the workplace as it's happening. Final example that I want to give to bring extreme users to life was in Dong DK. Dong DK basically means Danish oil and natural gas. Denmark, based out of Copenhagen. They had a radical idea about changing the way in which manufacturing occurred in some of their key areas. And what they did was used experiments of taking very small but identifiable areas that didn't necessarily have a profound impact initially upon shareholder value, and gave them the opportunity not only to conduct their manufacturing, which they were there employed to do, but also to be responsible for supply chain, for finance, for HR, for all of the functions necessary to change this small unit into a fully operational individual organization. And what happened was remarkable, because they had the opportunity to examine the extreme users and their behaviors are what really drove not only profit for shareholders, but generated value for the organization that went on across Dong DK and exists today. There are many, many examples from pharmaceutical to aerospace and also to the utilities industry. So, Tess, do you have any questions at all about this idea of extreme users and why it's so important?
No, I don't think I have any questions. I think it's really clear, actually.
Okay.
I like the examples.
Okay. Well, let's just come up with another example. This one I love because in the process of extreme users developing the profile of what they do, we really encourage them to create storybooks. And in the storybooks, it examines something, it highlights something quite unique. In this situation, which was for a company called Xylus, which IDEO contributed to in terms of looking at the design of kitchen utensils, what they did was that they took a granddaughter and a grandmother and put them together. So you had arguably one of the extreme users at one end. Let's take the granddaughter, who maybe didn't have such an emphasis on cooking, and the grandmother, who, for the choices that she had made, was in a position for providing food for the family and could be considered an extreme user at the other end. The key bit about putting these two fine people together was an opportunity to examine the utility of kitchen instruments. In other words, the form and the function. Now, the outcome of this was remarkable because the outcome showed the development of these kitchen appliances, but based on function rather than form. I want to draw your attention to the top right-hand side, which is the pizza cutter. Now, the pizza cutter here arguably is missing something, namely the handle. And that is because when you examine the way people cut pizza, they very rarely use it from a handle, but actually apply the pressure directly downwards. It changed the design radically. You didn't need the handle to get the optimal function out of a kitchen utensil. I want to give you a very quick story to end this with. And the story was a hotel that myself and my business partner worked in North London, where they radically described the check-in and the operation in the hotel as the new modern experience of hotel management, which was simply this. You didn't check in with an individual, you checked in via an iPad. Fabulous idea, except the iPad froze, and it took 45 minutes to check in where it would normally take 5 minutes. On entering the room itself, all of the operation of the room was embedded in an iPad, which was embedded in a wall. Now, that was all very well, except that the iPad froze again, which meant you couldn't open the curtain, you couldn't operate the TV, you couldn't switch the light on or off, you couldn't operate the shower, you couldn't use the telephone to ring the maintenance people to come up and unfreeze the iPad. I remember on leaving, they asked me for some feedback, and it was very simple. It would be useful to put a switch in the room in order to operate the lighting. It's a very simple and somewhat quite humorous anecdote, but form and function really need to be paid attention to when looking at developing things around the extreme users. So, more to come in a moment, and we will finish there.